My name is Bob Butler. I was with the Milwaukee Road Engineering Department from June of 1968 through February of 1978. During that period, I worked mostly on the Coast Division out of Tacoma, Washington, but covering the whole Coast Division, later the Washington Division. I spent 9 months at La Crosse, Wisconsin as the Assistant Division Engineer. Ended up being the Division Maintenance Engineer for the Coast Division. I was also the Project Engineer on the new Fife Yard. This is my wife, Betty. She also worked for the Milwaukee Road. I'll let her tell you more about her experiences, but we met when she was my secretary in the engineering department at Tacoma.
That was in 1970, and it was difficult working with someone you were dating too, so we decided the relationship was worth it. So I transferred to the train master's office, where I used my shorthand and I took investigations from derailments and other problems that they had. So that kept me busy. So I worked for the Milwaukee for a little over 9 years. Mostly at Tacoma. I spent some summers at La Crosse, Wisconsin, working in the summer there during the high school years. My dad was a superintendent there, and that's about it.
Some of my duties included doing track inspections with the roadmasters. We did an annual bridge inspection of all bridges and culverts on the division. That was usually done either by motor car or high rail, where we would cover every inch of track on the division over usually about a month period with some breaks on it. So you had to be able to get up, and this was pre-OSHA days when you didn't have harnesses or anything. You get out, you walk the stringers on the timber bridges. A lot of these were up to 100 foot above the ground, no safety nets. So it was quite an experience. You're looking for decayed timbers. I remember one time we were looking at culverts. The B&B foreman, who was in charge of the culverts and the bridges, also did these inspections with us. Went down to check a culvert up in the Cascades. He came running back out of the brush. We saw a bear running up into the hill. Two didn't want to be together at the same time. But it took a lot of, especially on the culverts up in the Cascades and over in Idaho, it was a lot up and down on the embankments because you had to go all the way down to the bottom, look through the culvert, make sure it was a clear shot, or if there were obstructions, figure out what it was. And the whole time we were writing up a report that would go into Chicago with our recommendations for bridge and culvert maintenance for the coming year. Some we found were even so bad that we had to take the track out of service right then. This is fairly rare, but occasionally you find a stringer that had been crushed. That was the lateral support on the bridges, and you had to get a crew out there and replace that stringer before you could let a train over it. I was also involved in derailments, a type from ones that were caused by a track defect. We would have mudslides that would come over the track, train would hit it, tip the train over, and we would have to go out and pick those derailments up in connection with the mechanical department. I was responsible for bringing in rented heavy equipment like mobile cranes and cats. The mechanical department would bring out the wreckers, and it was a coordinated effort that we would build track up to the derailment. They would put the cars back on or tip them off to the side. Then we'd build some more track, and that would continue until you get the line open. The priority was getting the main lines back open, because either the trains were not running at all or they were detouring over competitive railroads where you had agreements, but you paid them a big premium for running on their railroad. So you would be continually getting calls from the superintendent, when are you gonna have my main line open again? Sometimes it'd be a few hours, sometimes it would be a whole week. We also had occasions where we would lose bridges, either from the weight of the train or a burned off journal. We had one just to the west of here where a Reading car had a burned off journal on a steel bridge, wiped out part of the end of the bridge, plus the hot bearing burned, set the creosote ties on fire, which went to other parts of the railroad bridge. In that case, we were over a main river. We had to get permission from the operators of the dam upstream to shut down all flow in the river, take our equipment into the riverbed, and then move our equipment in, lift the cars out that had derailed on the bridge, bring a pile driver in, drive piles, put stringers on top of those caps, and support the steel bridge enough that we could get service restored, and then you would come back later and rebuild the bridge.
So what was a typical kind of day at work like? I mean,
There were no typical days.
days.
We were a station office, we had the normal amount of office work, but if you got a call about a derailment, a slide, a fire, then you took off and you took care of that problem till it was open. Typically, we would be up for 24 to 48 hours, getting all the equipment and the manpower lined up, then you're 12 on, 12 off. And that could last up to a week.
You said you handle derailments, reporting and stuff like that. Are there any that stick out in your mind? Any stories?
The first one I took, because I was just new to that whole environment, we have so many days to notify the person that we're investigating, and then you're always under timeline. You have days to get it back and to notify him, and you have to sign that this is verbatim, you know, the whole court reporting. And I typed my first one, they were talking about glass. No, they were talking about class, and I typed it as glass all the way through. Well, we found it, so I had to go back through and correct it all the way through, because the union rep could have thrown it all out because of that. So it was very nerve-wracking, because you're always watching the timing of the different derailments, and you don't have just one investigation at a time. You have maybe 3 or 4 going, so you're always notifying or meeting with labor relations people. So, but it was difficult, but it was a fun assignment. So,
Yeah, tell 'em about your relief operator on the telephone switchboard.
I did that too. And there aren't many people that know how to work one of those. Just it was really an antique when I worked it in 1970. And it was interesting, because you talk to people all over, and then you keep clicking to hear if the line is busy before you can connect them and things like that. And so it was a little job, kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So there was always changes, but you got to meet people all over the country, and I still know a lot of people throughout all the division headquarters and things. So.
Tell 'em who. No, her dad was Maury Savage. He was the second to the last superintendent on the Coast Division. John Stuckey, who was a good friend of the family, was the last superintendent.
So how did y'all feel when you found out that Milwaukee was closing?
We left before the closing. I left in February of 1978. But I could see the handwriting on the wall. My job had gone from building a new yard, and that stopped as soon as the bankruptcy occurred. All the money disappeared. We had gotten as far as going through the environmental impact statement, getting approval from the city of Fife, and starting to place the fill. We got about 3/4 of the fill in, and everything stopped dead. Plus, I was spending a lot more time picking up derailments than doing anything constructive. So,
It was a loss though, because I had grown up with the Milwaukee Road and it had always been part of my life. And, you know, my dad and his brother and his father, so, you know, it was a tough to see it
yeah.
going
And
away. So.
unlike modern corporations, it was more like a family. It was almost like being in the military. 'Cause we were on call 24/7. Long before that was a popular term. So if you had a derailment and they called you, you went. So most of the parties and so forth were among railroaders. People who were not familiar with that environment didn't understand when you had to leave.
Even during someone's wedding,
Yeah.
there was a derailment and they waited to tell everybody until after the ceremony. But afterwards, every man,
Including the bridegroom.
yeah, including the groom, they left for the derailment. So, and a lot of people just don't understand that you can't commit to, yes, we'll be available for dinner on Saturday night. If the phone rings, you know, he gets a page and he's gone, so.
Yeah. So I always had a bag packed and ready to go, because you never knew how long you were gonna be out there.
Well, in better days, before everything started jumping the tracks, what other kinds of projects were you working on besides the Fife Yard?
We did the yard up at Tukwila. You've probably seen the tracks up in the shopping area there, aren't used very much anymore, but that was a very big project to go in there. Because that originally was mostly warehousing, which is now mostly retail. And they get the carloads there. They were just finishing the Kent yard when I came on board with Milwaukee. I was involved in a number of rail relays. We put down new rail and recovered old rail, tie programs.
Where was engineering based out of?
Tacoma,
It was-
Washington, yeah.
In your office would have been Tacoma as well?
Tacoma.
Okay.
But I was traveling probably at least 50% of the time.
How far did you go?
I went all the way from the branch lines that went out to the Pacific Ocean, Grays Harbor and Raymond, all the way to Avery, Idaho. Went up north to Sumas, north to Melding Falls. You had the Hanford line going south. Later on, we had trackage rights on the BN down to Portland. So if there's a derailment, we still went down on those derailments. They had the primary responsibility cleaning up, but we had to take a look at what we thought was the cause, because there's always the interchange between the railroads on who was going to pay for what. If you had a crop fire where you set the wheat crop on fire, this mainly in eastern Washington, you had to go out and measure the acreage so the claim department could pay off the farmer. Was involved in bridge rebuilds and going out and doing the measurements, doing the surveying so they got the right elevations for the cutoffs on the piles. Also did the snow sheds along Lake Ketchulus. We had to rebuild those on a regular basis. The humpback snow shed on the west side, just down from the Snoqualmie Tunnel. Occasionally we'd go out on snow service with the snow plows, along with the roadmaster. So it was a very interesting job. You never knew what you were gonna really be doing that day.
What was your favorite part of your jobs that you liked the best?
Going out on the railroad. And occasionally I'd get to ride the locomotives or a business car on the trains. That was always interesting.
I enjoyed, the train master and I would sometimes have to drive to where the investigations were and things like that. And you met a nice crowd of people usually, and there was one that was, it was a little tougher when he was being accused of raping a young girl. And we had to work with the sheriff's department to work that out, and they gave a lot of input in that, and that was a totally different one and something like that. And so it was just, you know, the variety. So I liked it. Got out of the office. Usually it was my husband that was out of the office, but occasionally I got to go.
Yeah. And we were also at the very beginning of the environmental regulations. Being the youngest engineer in the office at that time, I became the environmental officer. But if you had derailment, you know, you'd usually rupture the tanks on the engines if the engines were involved. That kind of stream, then you had to take care of the necessary actions, try to minimize that, and you're dealing with the Coast Guard. There one where I had to take on a vice president from Chicago that was sent out because I was writing nasty reports about roundhouse procedure, and he came out to state that his people would never do anything like what I was stating. I was just being a disruptive person. So I took him out to show where the fences had occurred, and Roundhouse obliged me and dumped a vat of cleaning fluid right at that time. So we all trooped back to the office, and it was totally silent for that VP. And I did get cooperation. From that point on, I was good friends with the Roundhouse Forum.
Where was your office based out of in Tacoma? Was it in the shops there, or
In the freight house.
Oh, in the freight house.
Yeah. We were on the south end upstairs, and you had the superintendent's office, train master's office, the dispatcher, signal and communication supervisor, B&B foreman, the engineering department, and two of the roadmasters, one that had line south and the one that had the joint line in the Tacoma yards.
Can you tell us what the train master's job would be?
Can I tell you?
Yeah.
But Bob would be happy to tell you.
Well,
No,
he is responsible under the superintendent for making sure that the trains were leaving on their schedule. You didn't have a timetable, but you had a time that they were due out from the yard. They had the proper number of cars on the train. So he was basically in charge of all the trainmen. So that, and when I started, that was still a 5-man crew. You still had the engineer, the fireman, head-end brakeman, rear-end brakeman, the conductor. Switch crews, you had a foreman and the engineer and one or two helpers, depending on how many cars they were handling. But they were responsible, the train master was, for making sure that they were not only getting their trains out on time and over the division in an appropriate amount of time, but they were obeying the rules. And one of the big problems back in that period was Rule G, which was alcohol. You still had a culture at that time of drinking. And then it was a very big problem that they had to handle. And they would do also what was called a signal test, where they'd go out, take a cable and shut out the line, turn the signal that was normally green to red, make sure that the train crew stopped before they passed that signal.
See, he described it much better than I would.